Fossil fuels. They power our world. They let us run machines to grow our food. They let us fly a plane 5,000 miles in half a day. In the modern globalized world we live in, everything depends on fossil fuels. But there's a problem. We can't depend on them anymore. What is a fossil fuel? Hundreds of millions of years ago, the Earth was covered in giant swamps during what was known as the Carboniferous period. Because of increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, the Earth was warm and wet. This meant that plants growing during the Carboniferous were huge. When these plants died, they sank to the bottom of the swamps they grew in. They then became peat, and were then covered by layers of sand and clay. Over millions and millions of years, these plants were covered by more and more layers of rock, and were exposed to increasingly huge amounts of pressure. Eventually, this resulted in the formation of coal, oil, and natural gas. The fossil fuels we use to power our cars today are the remnants of ancient plants that preceded even the dinosaurs. What about fossil fuels' recent history? Humanity started to really take an interest in fossil fuels starting in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. The first real oil or petroleum was pumped by the American Edwin L. Drake on August 27, 1859 at a well near Titusville, Pennsylvania. The basic method Edwin developed for pumping oil from underground is still in use today. The market for oil really took off at the turn of the 20th century with the invention of the automobile. Early cars could actually run on steam, electric power, or gas, but gasoline became the preferred power source because, of the three, it had the greatest possible mileage before a refuel. Fossil fuels became a necessity to the transportation industry during World War I, when the motorized vehicle replaced the horse as the industrialized world's favored mode of transportation. Countries like Britain only had 800 cars at the beginning of the war, but by the end they had over 92,000. Oil production skyrocketed, and black gold quickly became a strategically valuable resource. Up until World War II, the United States produced 65% of the world's oil. However, it quickly lost ground to the Middle East, where supergiant oil fields in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait were discovered in the 1930s and 40s. As industrialized nations became ever more fossil fuel dependent, concerns rose over whether the West was being too reliant on the Middle East for its energy. These concerns were turned into legitimate fears when a series of oil shortages occurred in the 1970s. First when Israel was attacked by Syria and Egypt in 1973, and then during the Iranian Revolution of 1978. This resulted in programs like Project Independence, an undertaking by the U.S. to increase domestic energy production with the construction of coal, nuclear, and synthetic fuel power plants in order to decrease dependence on Middle Eastern exports. Unfortunately, support for these measures as well as clean energy sources has swung back and forth over the years along with fluctuating oil prices. And now we're here, the 21st century. Coal, oil, and natural gas account for 80% of the world's energy today. Energy consumption is growing quickly and is expected to increase by 50% by the mid-2030s. While some new sources of oil and natural gas will continue to be found, at our current rate of consumption, the Earth's fossil fuel reserves are expected to run dry within only 30 years. While fossil fuel extraction methods and technologies continue to improve, opening up previously inaccessible reserves like shale gas, the global fossil fuel supply is still finite. It will eventually run out. This will have major ramifications for our industrial lifestyle. 70% of all fossil fuels are used to power our transportation. Petroleum is used not only to make fuel, but also a wide range of consumer and industrial products including fertilizers, clothes, and almost all plastics. One of the strongest incentives we have to stop using fossil fuels for transportation is to conserve them for their essential industrial applications. But that's not the largest problem. The largest problem by far posed by fossil fuels is not their short supply, but their severely adverse impact on the global environment. The burning of fossil fuels releases large amounts of carbon dioxide, or CO2, into the atmosphere. Excess CO2 in the atmosphere causes what is known as the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide, methane, and water vapor, in addition to CO2, trap heat near the Earth's surface, causing a phenomenon known as global warming. Since 1880, this has caused the Earth's average temperature to increase by 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit, and the last 20 years of the 20th century were the warmest on record since 1600. Climate records have been smashed yearly in the last decade. The effects of global warming and climate change are the worst in two very opposite places, the Arctic and coral reefs. Record amounts of sea ice have been melting, putting indigenous peoples and polar bears alike in the Arctic at risk. Glaciers all over the world have been melting, and the rate at which they melt is accelerating. The Arctic is predicted to have its first totally ice-free summer by 2040. Coral reefs, although not melting, are dying. The worst reef die-off in history was recorded in 1998. Coral is extremely sensitive to changes in water temperature, which are attributed to climate change. But the impact of fossil fuel emissions isn't limited just to the far north and the tropics. By the end of the century, sea levels may rise up to 2 feet, threatening the world's densely populated coastal regions, including Florida, Louisiana, and even New York City. Climate patterns are already becoming more extreme. Wildfires, heat waves, droughts, and hurricanes are becoming more common in more places. In the worst-case possible scenario, changes in ocean currents could plunge Western Europe into an ice age. If fuel emissions continue to be unregulated, the Earth's temperature could increase to the point that carbon dioxide stored in permafrost and sea ice would be released, creating a positive feedback loop that would make climate change unstoppable and a global ecological crisis inevitable. So what's the solution? To at least slow climate change in the near future, drastic measures need to be taken. The world's carbon dioxide emissions need to be cut significantly. Our power sources need to become green. Wind, wave, solar, and geothermal sources are all viable long-term fossil fuel alternatives, but all have major initial investment costs that governments and policymakers aren't willing to pay. The biggest consumer of fossil fuels, the transportation industry, also needs to be weaned onto an alternative energy supply. Here, electric-powered cars that don't emit CO2 look like the most promising solution. Finally, we need to start taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and trapping emissions at their source using carbon capture and storage technology. Our destiny has been and continues to be intertwined with fossil fuels. They have enabled us to industrialize in the past, and they will enable us to destroy ourselves in the near future. Whether or not we let that happen is up to us. What will you do about it?